Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
So we're wrapping up April, and we're now at the end of our consideration of Nyoho teachings as they apply to clothing. And from here we move on to food. So again, we're taking this year to look at teachings about Nyoho, or what I'm sort of calling tangible thusness, right? So we know there are three faces of Nyoho: clothing, food, and shelter. So the first 4 months we've been focusing on teachings about clothing. Now we're moving into teachings about food. So this is a good time, I think, to take what we've learned about one and start applying it to the other. So what have we learned about clothing that we can also apply to food? I'm going to just say, would you lift up that camera? Give me a little headroom. I used to work in television, so these things I notice. So we're just going to, there we go. Thank you. Okay. So let's think about what did we learn from clothing? How do we apply that to food? And then maybe what lies in that intersection? Because there's some interesting stuff in there. So back in January, when we started our work on tangible thusness, I think as a community, we didn't yet have a really good idea about what Nyoho is about, what those teachings were about. So again, Nyoho, the Dharma of thusness. So we saw that food, clothing, and shelter can all be made, encountered, acquired according to the Dharma of thusness as a practice. We can take these things on as a practice. So we learned that the central question of Nyoho practice is, does this thing create attachment? So whether we're looking at a robe, a bowl of food, a building, whatever, does this thing create attachment? So that's an important question, whether this is a thing that we're acquiring, a thing that we're making, a thing that we're encountering. So in the case of clothing inside the temple, we're talking about robes, primarily okesa and rakusu. So in this family, we sew our own okesa and rakusu according to the way Sawaki Roshi has handed down. So he's given us some instructions. He's carrying something forward for us. We've also picked that up, and this is now part of our practice. So we don't make and wear these things as an expression of our own sort of ego attachment. This is not my robe. This is Buddha's robe, right? And anybody here wearing a robe, that's not your robe, right? That's Buddha's robe. So we can still ask ourselves these questions about attachment when it comes to the everyday clothing we wear outside of the temple. We've had some conversations about that. Are we attached to a particular way of presenting ourselves through our clothing that's creating some unwholesomeness for ourselves, for others? How can the everyday action of simply getting up in the morning and getting dressed or changing our clothes be a Dharma gate that allows us to do some reflection, do some discernment, right? We do these things every day. How can we take that opportunity to turn that into a Dharma gate? What's our attitude toward acquiring new clothes? What's our attitude toward letting go of old clothing, right? All of that becomes part of our practice. So someone asked Dogen whether it was better to mend and keep old clothes rather than discarding them, because that can turn into a habit of clinging. I can't let go of this thing, or I shouldn't let go of this thing. And yet, if we want to throw out the old clothes, they have a hole, they have a something, right? We want to throw that out and get new things, then that can turn into greed. So what's in that intersection? Somebody's asking him, right? How do we practice with that? Because both of those things can be exercises in ego. Either, am I not a terribly humble and pious practitioner because I'm keeping these old clothes, right, and not going after something else? My clothes are sort of raggedy. And I have to say, I've seen that, not here. Or, I'm a really spiffy, impressive practitioner because I've got brand new shiny stuff and all my things are in perfect condition. So Dogen said, either option, mending stuff or replacing stuff, is okay as long as we're not stuck, right? As long as we don't have any ideas about what we're doing there. We should just do the most appropriate thing and not be driven by our ego. But, he says, still, it would be better to mend torn clothing in order to keep it as long as possible and not lust after new clothing, right? So we have permission to get new things, and also it's good not to be sort of caught up in that. So this kind of teaching is just one example of Dogen saying, well, it's not always immediately clear what we should do about things like clothing and food. These are basic, necessities of life, and yet there can still be some mystery about that, right? Some unclarity about that. Sometimes an argument can be made for both options in a question, and then where do we look as a point of reference? Right? How do we make a choice? This is when having Nyoho guidelines, I think, is helpful, although that still doesn't make the answer obvious, as we've just seen, right? But having some kind of Nyoho guidelines to at least go back to and consider can be helpful. So elsewhere, Dogen says, it's difficult to determine what is good or bad. In the mundane world, people say it is good to wear garments made of fine cloth with golden embroidery, and bad to wear robes made of coarse cloth and abandoned rags. In the Buddha Dharma, the latter is good and pure, while luxurious garments embroidered with gold and silver are considered bad and defiled. In the way, the same is true for everything. So at the end of this piece of writing, he says, because a sangha is born from the realm of purity, things that do not arouse human desires are considered good and pure. So he's not using the term Nyoho here, but boy, that sounds to me like Nyoho, right? Things that do not arouse human desires are considered good and pure. So we can also apply questions about grasping and attachment and clinging to food, right? What ideas do we have about food that create some clinging? So in this case, we're not necessarily talking about childhood attachment issues that may lead to eating disorders. And in the West, we hear about these things. So let's sort of be clear. If those are indeed our karmic circumstances, then it can certainly be useful to do some discernment here around food and our relationship to food. We might use a poor relationship with food to deal with difficult emotions, try to get some control over some aspects of our lives when karma is unfolding and we can't quite get ahead of it, right? But those issues are about insecure attachment to people. That's kind of a different topic. Right here, we're focusing on attachments to food itself and our ideas about the food. So inside the temple, just as clothing means robes, typically our food practice centers on cooking and eating meals formally within sesshin. That's where we really get to focus. That doesn't mean we don't apply these teachings to snack time and tea time and other kinds of things. But that's where we really get to have some guided focus, if you will, on these teachings about food. So we use a standard set of bowls and utensils, right? We use our oryoki sets. We do meal practice in particular predetermined ways. We do things in a certain order. We handle things in a certain way. Also, there are guidelines about what we actually put into the bowls, what food is actually going into those bowls, and helps us just to make sure that food supports zazen, supports sesshin practice. So this kind of intensive container allows us to practice with food in a really intentional way, and also in a way over which we often don't have control. We don't get to choose what comes out of the kitchen and goes into our bowls, right? Which can be a really interesting practice by itself. So we pay attention to food just like we pay attention to everything else about sesshin, right? So we don't make and wear robes from a place of ego. We don't offer and eat food from a place of ego. This is food that feeds practice, not egos. And if you've ever been a tenzo, that's a real intersection. How do I make food that supports practice and is not about my idea about what a wonderful cook I am? So outside the temple, in our homes, in grocery stores, restaurants, the question is, are we attached to particular foods or ways of making and eating meals that are causing unwholesomeness for ourselves and others? Here's this basic question again, right? How can the everyday action of eating meals, just like the everyday action of wearing clothing, be a dharma gate that allows us to do some reflection, do some discernment? What am I doing here? What's going on? Where's my, what's going on with my thinking? What's going on in my body and mind? So we've seen that Nyoho things take into consideration three aspects, right? We have Tai Shiki Ryo, Tai or materials, Shiki or color, Ryo size or amount. So we applied these things to clothing. Now we need to apply them to food. So certain materials are appropriate for robes. Generally, things that are unpretentious, fit for purpose, often local if we can. So fabric, plain, simple, sturdy enough to hold up to sewing and wearing and not something exotic. Likewise, Nyoho food, generally simple, natural if we can, nutritious. Here at Sanshin, we're making an effort to serve locally grown food. We're actually looking around to say how can we have relationships with local growers and incorporate that into our practice. So this food also needs to be something we can serve and eat with the utensils, the bowls, the things that we have, right? So how can we make sure what we're serving is something people can eat with bowls and spoons and chopsticks? And I've seen what happens when tenzos don't take that into account. Again, often not here, right? Something with really stringy cheese. Try to get that into an oryoki bowl, man. Not so easy. Or I've had people struggle with things like lentils in a bowl where you can only use chopsticks. Like, how are you going to do that, right? So all of it becomes part of our consideration. And also we have to think about the things that go in these bowls have to be something that can only be washed up with hot water, because we're not using soap to wash those during meals. So we have to think about, is there grease and oil going in there, because that's not water soluble. So it really becomes a very intentional, comprehensive practice. So when it comes to color, we know that robes are made in mixed colors, broken colors, not flashy primary clear colors. Color considerations for a meal are that we include 5 colors so that we have a mix. Again, it's not broken color, but we have a mix. So we have white, black, red or yellow, green and brown. So if we can, we get all the colors into a meal. It's not that certain colors are prohibited. There's no color that's prohibited. Oh my gosh, that's too red of an apple, right? we don't have to worry about that. But that there's a variety of color. Needs to be a balance of color. So not only does that make the meal more visually appealing, it probably means that's nutritionally balanced. We don't have 3 bowls of white starch, right? We've got some balance of color. We probably have some balance of nutrition. So finally then, of course, there's size or amount, ryo. So a robe needs to be the right size to cover the body, or if it's your rakusu, long enough to cover your hands. With food, we need to buy and prepare enough food to feed everybody. Everyone needs to get adequate food, but not so much that we have extra that's going to waste. Particularly because in the temple, everything is donated, right? So maybe someone's donated the food, but maybe someone's donated the dollars that bought the food. So we are not allowed to waste anything. So we have to be really careful. This is not like cooking for a dinner party or your family reunion where you might think, well, we'll make twice what we need just to make sure there's enough. Not in the temple. We've got to actually aim for the right amount. So we also can consider how much food we are taking and eating as individuals, and whether there's anything we'd like to change about that. That's what I'm doing at the moment. There's a little too much Hoko at the moment. So how much food am I taking and eating? And I really need to think about that. So we can consider all those things related to the meals we eat at home. Are they wholesome, appealing, nutritious, balanced? Is this food we can easily serve and eat? Is this food we can offer to our friends and family without ego attachment, right? Ideas about who this thing makes us. So it's fun to have something exotic sometimes. Sometimes it's nice to have some interesting new food, something we haven't tried before, something that maybe we don't have all the time. There is nothing wrong with that. This teaching is not saying we can't ever try something new, that we are, restricted to raw carrots and apples every day, and that's all that's okay. It's certainly fine to get something exotic and try it. Are we choosing exotic stuff because simple everyday ingredients somehow aren't good enough, aren't interesting enough, aren't flashy enough, aren't impressive, right? Are they not interesting enough in themselves, these carrots and apples? So that's where we need to pay some attention. So in the first 4 months of this year, we've begun to see how these everyday things like clothing and food can be important elements in our practice. It is certainly possible to go through life just ignoring these things as Dharma gates. I'm eating food on the way to something. I'm getting dressed in the morning on the way to something. It is possible to live that way, and probably most of the time we do. Now, having come together as a community and said we're going to think about these things, now we have an opportunity to really start taking advantage of those things as practice opportunities. Whether that's here, where we kind of remind each other, yeah, there's that Nyoho thing, or whether we're taking this practice home and trying to engage with it on a day-to-day. So here's something else from Dogen. And although he's talking to monks in this case, I would suggest we can apply this to all of us as practitioners. Although it is similar to other places, if we enter a temple, without fail, we will become Buddhas and ancestors. We eat meals and wear clothes just like other people. Still, if we simply shave our heads and reveal their roundness, wear a square robe, and eat gruel for breakfast and rice for lunch, we immediately become patch-robed monks. So, in other words, as soon as we approach our interactions with clothing and food as part of our commitment to practice, then these things can take on a different significance, right? They're not just things we need on the way to practice, right? They are not separate from practice. As soon as we enter into our interactions with these everyday things with this body and mind and this kind of intention, so to say, we've entered the temple, right? We've become real, sincere, wholehearted practitioners. And it kind of doesn't matter where we are. We could be here, we could be at home, we could be in a restaurant. it doesn't matter. We sort of carry that practice container with us. So for instance, meals in the training temple can be quite ceremonial. Ask Doju sometime what he's just experienced in the training temple. There's a lot of instruments and chanting and people moving around in very particular ways and things being handled and served and eaten in very particular ways. So in the training temple, you don't get up in the morning and slouch over to the churyo or the table or into the zendo in your pajamas and slouch over your Cheerios and coffee, right? It's just not the way that happens. So you wear full robes for meals. You do chants. You handle your oryoki, right? This is a full ritual. It's not unlike liturgy in a lot of ways, and yet we're simply eating a meal. So you also don't casually skip meals because you're not hungry. Well, I don't feel like eating today. You don't get that as a choice. And I've seen people try it, and then someone will go get them. Why are you not at the meal? Well, I didn't feel like eating today. No. The meal is practice. You don't skip meals, just like you don't skip zazen. Right? It is full communal practice. So it's not something you choose you want to do. You go to the meal. So what you wear for meals is important. It's not just the food in the bowls. You're wearing robes in the zendo, taking a meal. Or if you're around the table, you're at least wearing a rakusu. So there is some intention, right? Some connection, some relationship. What are we wearing as practitioners? And what are we doing with our bodies and minds when we're eating these meals? If you're the tenzo, you're the one cooking the meal, you have to get all the work done early enough, not so early that the food gets cold, but early enough to put all your robes on and do a full 9-bow food sending ceremony, right, out to the people eating. And you have to manage that timing. So again, even if you're in the kitchen, and you're up to your eyeballs in food pairings and steam, you get to put all that aside and go, I have to put this on, and go out and send that food into the sodo where people are eating it as part of their practice. This is not sort of casual and not intentional. So in the beginning, that's like, oh man, that's a nuisance. But when you really take that on board, it's like, that's really interesting. How do we approach serving food at home? We kind of go, here you go. So this is a whole intentional process. So that seems like a lot if you're used to just sort of grabbing a sandwich in your sweats on your way to something else, or you're eating in front of the TV in your favorite bathrobe, and this is how we may typically eat, particularly if we live alone. We kind of do whatever is easiest. But it's really an interesting opportunity for full immersion in practice and to see these everyday basic necessities as Dharma gates. And yet, we're just eating rice and pickles. So we can't get precious about it either. So we eat meals and wear clothes just like other people, and yet, in this intentional practice container, something is happening. Something else is happening. So during the sewing retreat, we saw that the rakusu is known as an antarvasa robe in Sanskrit. You might remember that word if you've seen tokudos, novice ordinations, right? So the meaning is something spiritual that's deep or inside with a sense of this connection or intersection between physical and divine. There's some kind of intersection there with an antarvasa robe or a rakusu, right? So clothing and food can both show us this intersection between form and emptiness. So yes, it's just a garment. It's a piece of fabric. Yes, it's just a ladle full of soup, right? It's a fork full of salad. And yet, right, it's nothing other than Buddha Dharma. So we can't get precious about it, and yet, here's the Dharma and food. So, one of the teachings we've heard over the last 4 months is robe and Dharma are one, and we will have exactly the same teaching when we come to food, right? Food and Dharma are one. So in the Zuimonki, Dogen says, robes, bowls, and other things are simply the ornaments of monkhood. Right? As Westerners, we might see that and go, yes! I don't want to get caught up in that stuff. So Dogen says, these are just ornaments, which makes them feel like something extra, right? The point he's actually making there is we don't need to wait until we have these things in order to practice, right? So we don't need to wait until we have the robe, the bowl, the perfect circumstances in order to practice. In that way, they are ornaments, right, of practice. So our jeans and our paper plates can serve us just as well, as long as we're seeing with the eyes of Buddha. But of course, Dogen also wrote significant texts, significant guidelines about how to engage with robes, how to engage with bowls, right? There's whole big texts about cooking and serving and eating and making robes and wearing robes and all of that. So both the specifics, like exactly how to carry out a meal using oryoki, how to decide how much food to cook. I mean, he gets quite detailed. If you look at the Fukuchampo, I mean, my gosh, it's, tells you exactly step by step how do you eat the meal. So there are really specific guidelines from him. Do it exactly like this. And also, of course, he's got these larger, more abstract teachings, like the nature of the formless robe. What is the robe that doesn't have any characteristics? How can it possibly fit everybody, right? Or the identity of food and clothing with dharma. So he's got both of these things going on. So on the one hand, robes and bowls are signifiers or ornaments or something. And on the other hand, they're nothing other than dharma. So when the practice is sincere, whatever is being manifested by what we're eating, what we're wearing, can shift. So how do we hold both of these truths at the same time? So Uchiyama Roshi commented on Dogen's teaching that you must constantly reflect on yourself and never allow the loss of wisdom. One who does not act like this cannot be said to be a person of the way, nor can such a person be called a lay follower either. So this is Dogen's quote. Now, Uchiyama Roshi says, in India, lay followers wore a kesa-like robe that was white, while monks were only allowed to wear robes that had been dyed black. So, byaku-e, or white clothing, referred to lay followers or believers. Or even if they were wearing the black robes of a monk, if a person was not receiving and connecting with the essence, they were not considered to be followers of the way. Likewise, even though they were wearing the clothing of lay followers, they were no longer considered to be lay believers. So I think it's just another way to say we can wear humble robes, we can eat humble food out of oryoki bowls, but if we're just sort of going through the motions, we're not receiving and connecting with the essence, there's something missing there, right? Then those things are ornaments. They don't really signify anything. So it kind of doesn't matter what we're wearing if we're not really doing the practice. It doesn't matter what we're eating out of if there's not kind of wholeheartedness and sincerity there. So one thing we hear over and over from Dogen in the Zumonki is that we shouldn't be concerned about whether we're going to have enough food and clothing. He's always saying we shouldn't be storing up these vast reserves of supplies because we're worried about running out of something, right? Or worry about where the next meal is coming from. We should simply go about our practice, moment by moment, trust in the Dharma. Somehow we will have everything we need. So, for instance, he says, devote yourself only to the practice of the way and do not seek after food and clothing. Elsewhere he says, do not be troubled when it comes to food and clothing. Just maintain the Buddha's precepts and do not concern yourself with worldly affairs. So on first encounter, that sounds either like foolishness, irresponsibility, right? Failing to plan ahead, or like an attitude of martyrdom. Oh, well, I'll go without. If it's not here, okay. So both of those positions might feel fairly extreme. And, well, yes, he's probably trying to get our attention, right? Don't worry about where your next meal is coming from. Somehow the Dharma will provide. We have to remember, I think, also the likely context for this. So in tough times, probably monks and temples didn't have everything they wanted or needed, all the resources they needed. If there was a famine, if there was war, epidemic happening, folks were probably not too concerned about giving to temples. They were mostly concerned about taking care of their families, right? And we know there were tough times. There were wars and epidemics and famines. And so it was entirely possible that there wasn't enough food for everybody, or that things were not so easy. People were worried about their own survival. But I suspect where Dogen's really going with this is that if we are consumed by making sure that our situation is perfect with regard to clothing or food, we're living somewhere other than here and now. We're missing this moment, and this moment is really the only place we can practice. So if we're constantly worried about, am I going to have something to eat tomorrow? Am I going to have a robe to wear tomorrow? What's happening to today? What's happening to this moment and our practice in this moment? So here again, I think we have this line of balance that we get to walk. So I just managed all the meals for our sewing retreat, our week-long sewing retreat, which meant determining menus and buying groceries and cooking meals and making sure that everyone got enough to eat without creating leftovers and waste. So without planning and management and thoughtfulness, of course, that would have gone completely off the rails. That was 7 whole days of feeding a bunch of people, 6 or 8 people, right, several times a day. So any Tenzo knows the stewardship of temple resources is actually the major part of the job. There's a reason that Tenzo is actually quite a high-ranking office in the temple. It's not just about getting the food out for people. You are managing temple resources in a really important way, which goes beyond it being an accountant. There's something there about practice. Because again, all of those things were donated. So it's not just about making nice meals to impress people. There needs to be enough food to feed people, but the management of that can't come at the expense of living and practicing in this moment. We can't be so consumed by managing those resources that we're missing something, right, in this moment. We're missing practice in this moment. So Dogen says several times, as long as we're committed to practice, as long as we're practicing wholeheartedly, somehow the Dharma will provide. We can throw ourselves into the house of Buddha, and somehow the Dharma will provide. So somehow we will continue to have the things we need in order to keep ourselves alive. And the important thing is that our time, our focus, attention, energy go toward awakening before we die, because we have a limited amount of time with this body and mind, right? There's some urgency. As long as we're in this human realm, we have the opportunity to practice. So where should our attention be going? It should be going to that. So Uchiyama Roshi shared an interesting perspective on this using images of fresh flowers and artificial flowers. So he makes the point that people today are so concerned about living that they're not thinking about dying. So, in other words, everyone's thinking about survival, but they're not thinking about life. So then he says, if I were to express this another way, using flowers, it would be that life is a fresh and vibrant flower, while flower's survival is like an artificial flower that never ages and dies. Flowers are truly lovely. They blossom, but eventually they wither and die. An artificial flower never dies. It pretentiously blossoms in full glory, but over time it looks weather-beaten and gets thrown in the garbage. I love it. It pretentiously blossoms. So, of course, he's reminding us about impermanence here and the beauty that we find in things precisely because they are empty and impermanent and changing all the time. They arise and perish. This is Nyoho, right? Dharma of thusness. The thusness of these things are they arise and perish, and they're not permanent. So here we have another paradox, because one of the elements of Nyoho practice is to make a connection with the things that have gone before. So we saw this early on, right? One of the aspects of Nyoho, make a connection with what's come before. That might be studying the Vinaya. It might be, so we know like what the rules are, what the guidelines are. It might be reusing materials or objects that we already have, that are already here, rather than throwing them out, getting something new. Somehow we need to make this connection with what's gone on before. So there's that. And then also, if we cling to anything other than this moment in the service of Nyoho practice, somehow we've missed the mark. So if we're only trying to recreate something from the past or cling to something from the past, are we looking at what's going on in this moment? And there's an opportunity here to really go off the rails, because Nyoho is alive. It's dynamic, it's breathing, it's living, it's changing. It's not something which is someone's idea about something from the past. So Uchiyama Roshi concludes that by saying, looking at the dewdrops on the wildflowers in full bloom, we can feel their true beauty. But if we refuse to look at death and focus only on survival, then just as an artificial flower becomes discolored and dusty and ends up in the garbage, we too will become just another expendable existence that gets old and dirty and must be thrown out. So let's not be artificial flowers that get old and dusty and thrown away. So interestingly, Kodo Sawaki makes the same point, but of course he makes it in his own way, right? He's got his own voice. If you aren't careful, you'll start making a big fuss just to feed yourself. You're constantly in a hurry, but why? Just to feed yourself. Chickens too are in a hurry when they peck at their food, but why? Only to be eaten by humans. So it's really interesting how we've got these two teachers with such very different voices, but I think they're making the same point, right? So in our study of Nyoho, we get to bring some abstract teachings kind of down to our own level, put them on the ground, tangible thusness, right? Seeing the basic things we need to survive as gateways to the Dharma. So what is more immediate than that, right? What is more immediate than getting up in the morning, putting clothing on your body, putting cereal in your stomach and going out to do what you're going to do? I mean, it's just right here. How do you avoid paying attention to that? How do you avoid practicing with that? We can't keep living without these basic things, and we can't ignore them. So how are we shaping that relationship? How are we thinking about those encounters. And also, if we only see these things as a means of survival for this body and mind, we're still missing the opportunity to open our eyes. So yes, we need to take care of this body and mind as the ground of our practice. This is all we have. Without being in this human realm, without this human karmic mind and body, we can't practice. That means we have to take care of it. We can't ignore it. This is not a practice of somehow punishing the body, right? Minimizing the body. And we also need to take care of this moment as the ground of our practice, because we have no other place, time, opportunity to practice, right? So we have to take care of the body and mind, and we also have to take care of this moment. This is our opportunity, right? This is all we have. So in both cases, we need to ask, I think, what is alive here? What is changing? What is this Nyoho robe or meal or building trying to get me to see that I've been ignoring? So if all sentient and non-sentient beings are preaching the Dharma, like, what is this Nyoho thing, or anything I encounter, trying to get me to see that I'm not seeing, right? It's talking to me. Am I listening? Not in a magical way, right? At what point did the live, fresh, vibrant flower become the discolored, dusty, artificial flower? At what point did I stop paying attention, right? And freeze something and not notice that something was alive? Where have I traded the directness, the immediacy of this moment for my assumptions, my opinions, my ideas about what I'm seeing? When did I really stop looking, right? When did I really stop seeing that these things are alive? So it's a blessing when we can see basic everyday things in a new way. It cracks something open for us. I think this is the opportunity we have this year. When we're talking about tangible thusness, we can look at everyday things we encounter and use and interact with, things that keep us alive on a day-to-day. We get to look at them in a different way, not something we can take for granted, right? This is something that practicing with Nyoho things, I think, can do if we let that happen, right? So as we move into food, away from clothing, we're not leaving the whole clothing piece behind, but now here's the next phase. What do we get to take from what we learned about Nyoho clothing and sort of apply that to our relationships with food? And let's see where that takes us in the next 4 months. So what would you all like to say about interaction of food and clothing, living versus survival, anything that we've talked about over the last 4 months, or whatever's on your mind? I'm going to start with people in the room, and then Will's going to help me go to people out in the virtual world. Things in the room?
Yeah, I've got 2 things.
Okay.
First, a question. I tend to get depressed, and how I know I'm depressed is when I have no craving whatsoever for food. And by that, I would say just the thinking of enjoyment of sodium-filled soup, or thinking of the enjoyment of shiitake mushrooms and a lentil soup. Would that be considered, because you have no attachment, would that be considered Nyoho?
So are you asking about whether your attitude is in line with Nyoho, or whether that soup is a Nyoho food?
That distinction answers my question.
You had a second question.
Yes, it's more of a, I think it's more of a statement on Nyoho,
Okay.
or of Nyoho, of food. One of my practices that I developed out of sashimi, every morning I drink coffee and espresso with soda water. And when I get down to the very, very dregs, to the very bottom of everything, I will pour in some soda water into the what's remaining of the espresso and cite the verse of purity. Like a lotus in muddy water, the mind is pure and goes beyond, thus without a Buddha. And then I'll drink the dregs. Part of that was from, I really don't like drinking dregs, especially within a sashimi. So it's kind of to get used to it. But the other part of it was, realistically, as I started to do it and sit with it, was to be present with my coffee, even in the impermanence of it ending. So I don't know what the world will give me, but like a lotus in muddy water, the mind is pure and goes beyond. thus my day starts.
Mhm.
So,
thank you for sharing that piece of your practice, and what you said there just makes me think about the interesting relationship is the wrong word, but I'll use it. Relationship between food and impermanence, right? You eat food and it's gone. So unlike robes, we wear them, we might put the same robe on every day. Now, this is going to be interesting in the next 4 months to shift our perspective a little bit, because here's all this food, we eat the food, it's not really gone, but it's gone. So there's something impermanent about that. So that would be an interesting intersection for us. I'm glad you kind of sparked that. Thank you. Other things from folks in the room. Ritoku.
So the abbot for the Indianapolis Citizen Center is Link Rose, and he's married to Bobby Rose, who's now I don't know what you call it, the executive director for quantums all over the country. And of course, they lived together as husband and wife for a while. And he tells me of a story about how he was reading that famous Zen poem, The Great Way is Not Difficult. Make the slightest distinction and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. So he's reading that, and his wife says, Bobby, what would you like for breakfast? And he said, whatever. I said, I shouldn't have any distinctions, right? Mm-hmm. And she says, stop being silly now, tell me what you want for breakfast. Mm-hmm. Right. So, so in a situation like that, so we have the idea of non-attachment, mm-hmm. and yet we are biological entities, mm-hmm. and the body itself craves certain foods. Sure. The ego comes in there somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Choosing according to ego, but there's also a certain intuition of our biology, what our body needs. Mm-hmm. So in a Zen way, how do you distinguish between those two? So you don't have an ego preference, but you're still intuitively sensitive to the needs of your body. Yeah, well, so this teaching is not saying it's not okay to like Cheerios better than cornflakes, right? I mean, we've all got karmic circumstances, and as long as we're making choices that are not creating unwholesomeness, then there's nothing wrong with saying, well, today I feel like eating an English muffin. Right? So it's not that we can't make choices. Are we so attached to the English muffin that nothing else will do in a way that creates unwholesomeness? Then we have a problem. But I think you're not wrong when you say there's also this piece that says, if I listen carefully to my body will tell me what it needs. And as someone who lives in my head and not in my body, I'm actually not very good at that. One of the interesting practice questions I think we can work with in the next 4 months are things like that, right? Like, how do we choose food? During a session or when we're here, we don't have a choice. The Tenzo makes food and we eat what's presented and we accept that, and that's fine. When we're at home, we have to make choices. So it's not that we can't do that. It's how do we do that in a skillful way that doesn't create clinging. So when your partner says, what do you want for breakfast? It's not that the only acceptable answer is, I don't care, right? We have to make a choice, but are we making that choice in a skillful way? Are we saying, I will only eat, hummingbird tongues? Well, now we have a problem. So skillful choices are also skillful action. Right? Other things in this room, please.
Kind of maybe a related follow-up. So like when at Kotaiji in Japan, one of the things that was sort of interesting about eating was how many different kind of modes there were to do it. Mm. So, you have the most formal version in the Soto where you have servers and everything sort of following Dogen's guidelines as closely as possible. And then you have like sort of a more simplified oryoki sometimes in the sort of refractory sort of area. And then we had informal lunches where you would like serve yourself in the kitchen and go eat and do the chants by yourself on your own kind of time within a time frame. And then there were sort of informal meals like that, but where everyone was eating together. And it seemed, I talked before about like this idea of cluing into how people are feeling. And there was a system, maybe they had it at Toshoji also, but of giving like donations of meals, and mm-hmm. the higher ups could do that like with their own funds, I guess. Mm. So during sesshin in particular, where the normal expectation would be every single meal pretty much is eaten in the Soto in the most formal way, the abbot and some of the other higher ups would occasionally like pepper in these donations, and it was always noodles because you couldn't eat noodles in oryoki, so we had to eat an informal meal, which would give everyone a break from serving. And the serving was always kind of stressful, so it was kind of like a
That was
double
really kind.
gift. So I found that very interesting that they would be looking out for kind of the sort of needs of the sangha just based on the work that they all had to do through the food.
And how interesting that they were so good that they could subvert the system and give people what they needed, right? So we can't do this according to rules, so therefore we're going to put the rules over here and do something else. That's really skillful. Yeah, that's very kind. Nobody ever did for us in Toshoki, but I have to say, we did not often do full bore meals in the soda. We only did it when we had people in Chike training. So most of the time it was oryoki, it was at a table. So we didn't have quite the level of effort that you guys had. That's really interesting how they use the system to get around the system. Yeah, they're really good at that, aren't they? But yeah, so I mean, it's a skill, isn't it, to look around and say, not only what are we serving and is it something that is going to support people and nourish people, but what's the container for that? How are we doing that, right? Because there are times where that kind of really structured practice is very helpful, and then there are days when you need to do something else. So I think it's a great example of how we can really engage with these daily kind of necessities as real dharma gates. Because that could have been, well, it's just a meal. And that's not what's going on, right? The whole community got to participate in an interesting way, right? So I think it's a great example of using these basic things as means of shifting our perception and shifting our practice. Did people understand what was going on when that was happening?
I think so.
Yeah? They appreciated what was...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you were on the serving team that day and then you heard, oh, we're going to have an informal lunch.
Yes. Such attachment.
And interestingly, I remember a couple of times where somehow, so we only did formal breakfasts. So full bore oryoki, we only did for breakfast around the table. Lunch and dinner were less formal. They were still, we had to wear rakusu and I remember arriving for a meal at a lunch or a dinner, and our oryoki sets had been put. And everyone looked at oryoki, because they had to go change the clothes, because you couldn't do oryoki. Like, right. Man, like, why are we ratcheting this up, right? And I don't remember the reason for that, but it was the Tenzo's choice, right? Tenzo decided we were going to do a formal meal. We all got to look at our attachments with that as well.
Yeah, that's true too. The opposite would sometimes happen also, where we just like randomly have like a more formal meal for apparent reason. And everyone's like,
Gotta change my clothes. Other things in this room. Food, clothing, attachment, please.
Well, so one of the interesting kind of crossovers that I've started to look at between clothing and food has to do with the formal guidelines around color. Is a really interesting thing, because with the robes, at least, there's this teaching about we use a broken color, we use a kind of muddy color, not a sort of vibrant, flashy color that is kind of attractive. And then with food, particularly when we're serving people during sesshin, there's this encouragement to use a variety of color. In a way, that's kind of like broken color, because it's a mixture.
It's a mixture.
But in another way, it's like we're using primary colors. We're using sort of, in a way, it kind of gives you a lift. In a way, not, it gives you a lift to not see a bunch of just brown food. You've just been, sitting silently for hours on end, and the meal is kind of something different, and it also lifts you up and allows you to continue to practice. So there's this, hearing you two now just talking about kind of the morale factor of meals. it's really interesting to see that. And also to your question, Ritoku, about like what your body needs, it's like that teaching about different colors in a meal kind of maps onto nutrition.
Mhm.
So by the Tenzo putting the care in to put, you know, as many, some kind of variety of colors in a meal, it's like they're listening to your body for you in a certain way. And there's a certain amount of care that's kind of required. So those are observations, and then I wanted to ask kind of a question, because I've noticed, I mean, one of the things I've been paying attention to these 4 months is like, I keep looking at the tags of my clothing and see what it's made of, which is something that basically I just grew up my whole life not knowing at all what material my clothing is made of. And I think that comes from just growing up in a world in which these are sort of mass-produced items that are so easily available. You don't know the person who made them. You know, they're made by machines in massive industries, and they may be coming from, you know, far across the world, made in places with bad conditions. You know, all of that stuff is happening, and you just go to the store and get the final product. And I think that's both with food and clothing and shelter. I mean, any kind of material objects that we interact with in this kind of modern world, we're detached from it in a way that wouldn't have been the case for most of human history.
Mhm.
So we're just like, we have this level of distance from these objects that should be very close to us. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to sort of get over that. It's like we have a modern handicap or something about just being in touch with these basic necessities that seem to be just taken care of for us.
Yeah, well, so as we've said, when we look at materials, often local, right? We're looking for something local. So when it comes to food, we're looking for local food. When it comes to clothing, that's a little harder, right? We can't necessarily go down the block to someone who's weaving cloth and making clothing, right? So we get to make some choices. We all have to decide what the basis of those choices are. Do we want to only wear natural fibers, so we're not dumping microplastics into the water? Do we want to only acquire things from that we've made a certain distance or within a certain area, or, you know, we get choices to make. So I think that's one of the ways that this kind of practice is helpful, because you weren't even looking at that or thinking about that until you started thinking about Nyoho. And I think food is the same way. We kind of don't think about it, we just kind of eat, right? And we're given the opportunity to really look at what we're eating and where that's coming from. That's important. And also, we can get paralyzed by that. We can become so concerned about that we can't function, and I don't think that's what our teachings are aiming for. So let's be as skillful as we can be, whatever that means to us. Let's be as skillful as we can be, but somehow we still have to carry on. So I think there's nothing wrong with looking at the worlds of, you know, fast fashion and all of those things and making choices about how much of that we participate in. But I think if we were reduced to saying, I will only wear clothing that I made myself, and I grew my own sheep and spun my own yarn, and, you know, that's the only way we're going to live, not quite practical. So somewhere there's a balance there. But awareness is important, and even simply being aware is important. So are we acquiring things in order to have the most expensive, exotic, flashy, impressive? How much of what we have can be reused, secondhand, right? We have choices we can make. So I think what you're talking about is simply a great example of awareness. something is happening otherwise. As for food and morale, I have to say, early on as a Tenzo, boy, that was one of the first big lessons I learned. And it wasn't something like, oh, something bad happened, it's just like I really noticed food and morale. What I was putting out to feed people, there was a real relationship there with morale. So I do think one of the reasons that color, the variety of color is important is that the meal should be appealing. So nowhere do our teachings say, well, this should be, nutritious and wholesome and, local food. But having it be appealing is not okay. We actually want it to be appealing, and that's one way in which it's appealing. So it needs to be well made. It just can be simple ingredients. So I too have been, thinking about that, the sort of parallel between broken color of robes and mixed colors in food. I think it's the same through line, although it manifests differently, right? We have lots. I'm interested in what's coming up for people because I can see all the things we're going to explore in the next 4 months. Yay! Other things in this room before we go to virtual.
One other quick
Please.
thought. I had a fellow practitioner who insisted that, I mentioned like you can eat in a variety of formats. He insisted that the morning rice gruel tasted significantly better when it was in formal oryoki compared to like if you had informal oryoki or just like sort of. So you have to eat it slower, I guess. You're more focused on it. I don't know, but I thought that was interesting. He asked me about it once. He was like, "Don't you think it tastes better?" And I was like, "I don't really know. I haven't thought about it." And he was like surprised. He was like, "Really? Like, doesn't taste better to you?"
That's interesting. So when you were in the Soto doing that, did you use the wooden buckets to serve it out of?
Yeah.
And I wonder if, so he wasn't talking about something as mundane as it was coming out of the wooden bucket, so the texture was different because the bucket absorbs the water and shifts how that is?
Could be, yeah.
Mostly it was about.
Could be both.
Mostly it was about attitude. Oh, that's interesting. Well, so one of the things we can think about in these 4 months is, do we have some different response to that food depending on the circumstances? We should think about that. That's interesting. Other things here, please.
Just kind of a comment. It occurs to me that it's a little easier, of course, to get local food.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also thinking about local clothes and the fact that you could go to a thrift shop or Goodwill or someplace like that. It just adds another dimension to it. But then again, I think on top, if you go to Goodwill, some people may not connect politically so well with it, that sort of thing. So, so much to consider there.
Yeah, well, yeah. So really, any of these food, clothing, and shelter that we think about, one of the big pieces of that is not just what am I making, but am I requiring things, and then how is that happening, right? So we get to think about all of that. Because, you can go to the Goodwill and feel really very pious because you're having secondhand clothing, but if what you're buying there was not made in conditions that support human life, right? So, no easy answers. Other things here? Stefan, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Did you have something you wanted to say or ask?
Well, as the other questions developed, I've got a lot to say. I sort of feel like I'm sharing mostly myself, but first I'll start with the last question. I'm near 3 thrift shops, so I regularly look for different things there. Like they're literally 5-minute walk away. I get kitchen utensils from there. I still need something. They probably have something like that around there, and usually costs me $1 instead of paying like 5 or 15. I got a sewing machine for $25. Things like that. I heard about that. He was looking at the what his clothes were made of.
Yeah.
I've been looking at that since I was very young, because clothing has been a source of suffering for me since I was very young. And it was basically just because I'm kind of a sweaty guy, and synthetics don't really hold sweat that well. Also, I'm very sensitive, so tight clothing is something that doesn't work for me. So everybody always tried to fit me in skinny jeans because I kind of have the shapes that they want to see, especially women were doing that. So like my mother, my aunt, people from school and all that kind of shit. I didn't want that because it made me feel like I wanted to die. So as soon as I could, and I was no longer forced to, I started wearing jogging only, and that has continued since this day. So that's 12 years now. And everybody always talks to me about needing to wear jeans because of fashion, and I always give them a big middle finger. Um, then it's shoes. Shoes, they sneakers. They are too tight and they put my toes together and it hurts. And as soon as I come home after school, I take off my shoes and my pants. And my mother is always like, "Why do you do that?" And I'm like, "Because they don't fit well." I started at some point. I got a pair of slippers that were Birkenstocks, and they were kind of loose and they were kind of nice fitting. And all of a sudden, all I wear is slippers. Summer, winter, it doesn't matter. Snow, I don't give a fuck. Um, and then last 2 years ago, I found these Vibram Five Fingers. There was a dude that wore them while I was in university, and they looked kind of weird. And everybody now looks at me weird too. But they fit enormously well. And I will never go back to normal shoes ever fucking again. Um, Furthermore, I have been experimenting in the kitchen and making more and more things from scratch. It's really easy to make bread. It is literally like in RuneScape. You put flour and water together, and then you put it in the oven. Um, and I had no idea. The more I'm making myself, the more I'm realizing that all these, quick grab things with like a million ingredients, they're not like some sort of wizardry that's going on there. Um, Additionally, a lot of the products that you would be able to get from a supermarket, there are also producers that individually sell those products. And you could get them usually at like a very much lower price, and sometimes even, an unprocessed, better quality kind of thing that still has a great shelf life. Additionally, that was the final point now. As I've been making that stuff from scratch, I have been keeping into account all the things like shelf life and all that kind of stuff. And I knew exactly what I would get and, how I could make sure that I'm not wasteful and I don't waste anything and I don't waste any money. Also, making from scratch usually has some cost saving things. But I can imagine that if you are a Tenzo and you get donated things, you have to manage the shelf life, and that seems like an absolute goddamn fucking nightmare.
Well, so usually if things are, so here, if things are donated, they're generally donated around Sesshin. We know how many people we're feeding and, how long things need to be around. So it certainly needs to get managed, that's true. But one of the interesting practices about being a Tenzo is that when people donate things, we need to use them. So if it's something that, if it's noodles and it can't go in an oryoki bowl, right, we need to make a way to eat that. If it's something fried, we can't put that in an oryoki bowl, we need, to manage that. When we would go out to do funerals, we were always served huge bento. I mean, more than a human being could eat. I don't know how one human being could eat that much food. Full of fish and meat and everything, right? You don't say no thank you. So we would eat as much as we could eat and we'd bring it back to the temple, and usually the next day there was a big, a big buffet of some kind, a meal of some kind, because we needed to eat these things, right? So working with donations is interesting. I think I actually enjoy that in the same way that I enjoyed when I was doing the 108 gates, the talks on 108 gates. I didn't get to choose my topic, I just took the next gate. So I think that's a really interesting practice. So I'll just say the practice of making things from scratch, indeed, is a gateway. Often things are not as difficult as we think they could be. So if we can take care of ourselves and make things from scratch, that's an interesting practice. We can't always do it, but if we can. I remember the first time I said to somebody I made my own French fries, and they couldn't believe it. I said, "Cook potatoes, you put them in oil, it's not that hard." They just never thought about that was something you could make at home. So when we think about, what did our grandparents eat, they were making stuff for themselves. Okay, other things in the world of the virtual. Other folks have comments, questions? Callum, please.
No voice.
He's not
Just
talking.
really quick, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I got into veganism a couple years ago, and then I realized that I was turning it into like a religion. And so I kind of stepped down from that, and I would just be curious, like if that would be a subject we were going to cover, and if Dogen said anything about vegetarian or anything like that.
I can't believe that somewhere in the next 4 months, we're not gonna have some conversations about vegetarianism. Because at least in North America, it's a huge topic. So I'll just say, I'm sure that's going to come up. And you've raised an interesting point, which is we can start worshiping anything, right? So again, we're talking about attachment. Are these things creating attachment, and are they creating ideas about who we think we are? And it's not a reason to stop doing something, but it's a reason to look carefully at that relationship, right? So that's a huge topic, and I'm sure we'll hit it more than once in the next 4 months, right? We can look forward to those things, because that'll be on everybody's mind. So just know that's we're not done with that. Other things today, in the room or at home?
On my notice, note a concrete example of resource management is Sawyer sent me an email saying we have too much cheese, do not bring cheese. And so you'll find the cheese is all cut up, at least some of it, so I didn't bring any cheese.
Yay.
So this is a matter of resource management.
Good.
So we have to consume the cheese we have.
Yes, that's right. Let's make good use of everything that's donated. Anything else today? All right, let's do our closing chant. Thank you very much.